Evan, 27, clutches a faded photo of him and his ex, Miles, laughing in a Chicago storm. His phone buzzes with a cruel voicemail from his father. "You're no son of mine." Tears fall as he recalls Miles' infidelity, his life unraveling in a lonely apartment. But tonight, a stranger's knock will force Evan to choose, hide in shame or fight for himself. The rain outside mirrors the chaos within, hinting at a night that could change everything. The rain pounded against the grimy windows of Evan Carter's cramped Chicago apartment, a relentless rhythm that matched the dull ache throbbing in his chest. At 27, he sat hunched on a threadbare couch, the springs creaking beneath him, a forgotten mug of cold coffee leaving a faint ring on the chip table nearby. In his trembling hands, he clutched a faded photograph, its corners softened from too many nights of restless fingers tracing the memory it held. There he was, Evan, 2 years younger, his green eyes alight with a joy he couldn't summon now, his dark hair plastered to his forehead by a sudden downpour. Beside him stood Miles, his first love, caught mid-laugh under a shared umbrella, his arms slung carelessly around Evan's shoulders. The rain had streaked around them that day, a wild summer storm, but they'd been untouchable, wrapped in the kind of happiness Evan had thought would last forever. That was before everything broke. Before Miles' betrayal carved a jagged hole through Evan's life. 2 years ago, he'd walked into their shared apartment, early from a shift at the diner, and found Miles tangled up with Tyler, their mutual friend, on the couch that now sagged beneath him. The image still burned, Miles' flushed face, Tyler's startled gasp, the way the air had thickened with lies. "It's not what you think," Miles had stammered, but Evan had already turned away, the door slamming shut on 3 years of trust. The wound should have healed by now, scabbed over with time, but it hadn't. It festered, raw and open, every memory a fresh cut. Evan set the photo down, his fingers lingering on Miles' frozen smile before pulling away. He raked a hand through his unkempt hair, the strands falling into his eyes as he exhaled a shaky breath. The apartment was suffocatingly quiet, save for the rain's steady drumbeat and the occasional buzz of his phone on the cushion beside him. He didn't need to look to know who it was. The screen glowed accusingly, "Dad," and Evan's stomach twisted, a familiar dread coiling tight. He could ignore it, let it go to voicemail again, but some bitter part of him needed to hear the venom, to feel the sting he'd grown used to. His thumb hovered over the button, then pressed play. "Evan," came his father's voice, gravelly and cold through the tinny speaker. "I ran into Pastor Jim today. Asked about you. What am I supposed to tell him? That my son's a disgrace? That he's—" The message cut off, but Evan could fill in the rest. Pervert. Sinner. Failure. Words his father, Paul Carter, had hurled at him since he was 19, when Evan had sat him down in their suburban kitchen and confessed he was gay. Paul had slammed his fist on the table that day, his face red with fury, and told Evan to pray it away. 8 years later, the prayers had stopped, replaced by a disdain that cut deeper than any sermon. "If you'd just been normal," the voicemail continued, "none of this would have happened. Miles wouldn't have left you." The words landed like a punch, knocking the air from Evan's lungs. He dropped the phone, letting it clatter onto the coffee table, and pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes until spots danced in the darkness. Normal. That word had shadowed him his whole life, a ghost he couldn't outrun. Miles hadn't just broken his heart, he'd handed Paul the ammunition to prove Evan was defective, unworthy of love, of family. Tears slipped through his fingers, hot and silent, and he hated them, hated how weak they made him feel, how they betrayed the armor he tried to build. Evan worked nights at a greasy diner downtown, flipping burgers and pouring coffee for late-night stragglers. The paycheck kept the lights on, but it couldn't fill the emptiness. The cooks called him the quiet one, and the regulars barely noticed him beyond a nod, except for last week, when he'd overheard a trucker mutter, "That's the queer kid," over a plate of fries. Evan had kept his head down, scrubbing a grill that didn't need cleaning, but the shame had followed him home, seeping into the peeling paint of these walls. Chicago sprawled outside, alive with lights and noise, but Evan felt like a stranger in it, a shadow drifting through a city that didn't care. He stood, his legs unsteady, and crossed to the window. The glass was streaked with rain, blurring the glow of streetlights into smears of gold and red. People moved out there, laughing in bars, huddling under awnings, but Evan was apart from it all, trapped in a life that felt borrowed, not his own. Miles had stolen more than his trust. He'd taken Evan's courage, his belief that he could be enough. And Paul? He'd stripped away the last tether to a family Evan had once thought might accept him. The photo stared up from the couch, Miles' grin a taunt Evan couldn't escape. He turned his back to it, jaw clenched tight. He wasn't that wide-eyed kid anymore, the one who believed love could conquer anything. But here, alone with the rain as his only witness, the ache gnawed at him, a longing for something to pull him out of this abyss. He didn't know it yet, but that something was already on its way, carried on the wet wind of a Chicago night. The rain had eased to a faint drizzle outside Evan Carter's Chicago apartment, leaving the night heavy with a damp chill that seeped through the cracked window frame. Inside, the silence pressed down harder, broken only by the occasional drip from a leak in the ceiling that Evan hadn't bothered to fix. He paced the worn hardwood floor, his sneakers scuffing against the splintered boards, the photograph of him and Miles still lying face up on the couch like an accusation he couldn't shake. The voicemail from his father looped in his head. Miles wouldn't have left you. Each word a shard of glass twisting deeper. Evan stopped mid-step, his breath hitching as he fought the urge to scream, to shatter something, anything, just to feel less powerless. A sharp knock jolted him from the spiral, his heart slamming against his ribs. It was past midnight. Who would come now? Wiping his clammy hands on his faded jeans, he crossed to the door and squinted through the peephole. A stranger stood in the dim hallway, his dark hair damp and curling at the ends, a faint smile playing on his lips despite the late hour. Evan hesitated, his fingers hovering over the lock, then cracked the door open an inch. Yeah? He rasped, his voice rough from hours of disuse, edged with a wariness he couldn't hide. Hey, the man said, his tone warm but easy, like they'd met before. I'm Noah. Noah Ellis. I saw you at the diner earlier this week. You're Evan, right? He held up a crumpled napkin, and Evan's breath caught as he glimpsed his own face sketched in swift, sure strokes, the tight jaw, the shadowed eyes, the slump of shoulders he hadn't realized he carried. I drew this while you were working. Thought you might want it. Noah's brown eyes met his, steady and unapologetic, and Evan blinked, thrown off balance. You're giving me a drawing? At midnight? The words came out sharper than intended, suspicion lacing them like venom. Noah didn't flinch, just shrugged, his lanky frame relaxed in a paint-splattered jacket that smelled faintly of turpentine and rain. I was passing by, saw your light on. Figured why not? His voice was calm, almost too casual, and Evan narrowed his eyes, opening the door wider not out of trust but sheer disbelief. Passing by, he echoed, his tone dripping with skepticism. Noah stepped inside, shaking droplets from his sleeves, and the air shifted with his presence, earthy, alive, a stark contrast to the stale emptiness of the room. Evan crossed his arms, leaning against the wall as Noah set the napkin on the coffee table, right beside the photo of Miles. Look, Evan said, his voice low and tight. I don't know what you're after, but I'm not in the mood for whatever this is. He waved a hand vaguely, unsure what he was even pushing away. Noah sank onto the couch, hands shoved in his pockets, and looked up at Evan with a quiet intensity that made his skin prickle. I'm not after anything, Noah said softer now. You looked like you were drowning back there at the diner. I've been that guy. The words hit too close, slicing through Evan's defenses, and he turned away, staring at the rain-smeared window to hide the sting in his eyes. You don't know me, he muttered, his throat tight. Noah's voice followed him, gentle but firm. Maybe not. But I know what it's like to feel invisible in a city that never stops moving. I saw it in you, the weight you're carrying. Evan's chest constricted, anger flaring hot and sudden. He spun back, fists clenched. What, you think you can just show up with some sketch and fix me? I don't need your pity, man. Noah didn't rise to the bait, didn't even blink. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his gaze unwavering. It's not pity, Evan. It's recognition. I'm gay too. I've had nights where the world felt like it was closing in, where I didn't know if I'd make it to morning. The confession hung between them, raw and unguarded, and Evan froze, the air knocked out of him. He wanted to shove Noah out, to lock the door and bury himself back in the dark, but something in those steady eyes pinned him in place. "I don't do this," Evan said, quieter now, running a hand through his hair until it stuck up in messy spikes. "I don't let people in. Not anymore." His voice cracked on the last word, and he hated how it betrayed him, how it laid bare the scars Miles had left. Noah tilted his head, his question simple but piercing. "Why not?" Evan's jaw tightened, memories flooding back. Miles' laugh turning to lies, the sting of Tyler's smirk, the hollow ache of being discarded. "Because it fucking hurts," he snapped, the dam breaking. "The last guy I trusted slept with my best friend and walked away like I was trash. People don't stay, they just take." Noah nodded, absorbing the words without judgment. "That's on him, not you. But locking everyone out, that's letting him win." Evan glared, his pulse racing, but Noah's calm unraveled him. "I'm not here to fix you," Noah added, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just thought you might want someone to sit with it, the hurt, for a while." The offer hung there, fragile and unexpected, and Evan felt something crack inside him, a fissure he couldn't close. "Fine," he said at last, sinking into the armchair across from Noah, his shoulders slumping. "But don't expect me to talk." Noah's lips quirked into a small, genuine smile. "Deal." The rain tapped softly outside, a muted companion to the silence that settled between them. And as the night stretched on, Evan found the words slipping out anyway, halting, bitter, about Miles, about his father, about the loneliness that clung to him like damp clothes. Noah listened, his presence a quiet lifeline, and for the first time in years, Evan didn't feel quite so alone in the storm. The first gray light of dawn filtered through the blinds of Evan Carter's Chicago apartment, casting thin stripes across the cluttered room. He hadn't slept, his body wired with restless energy after a night of spilling jagged pieces of his past to Noah, who'd stayed, sprawled on the couch until the rain stopped. Evan sat at the kitchen table now, cradling a mug of black coffee that had gone cold, his green eyes bloodshot and distant. Noah stirred, stretching with a low groan, his paint-streaked jacket crumpled beneath him. "Morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep, flashing Evan a crooked smile that felt like a lifeline. Evan nodded, too drained to speak, but the quiet between them was softer now, less suffocating than the night before. Then his phone buzzed, a harsh vibration that sliced through the stillness. Evan glanced at it, Instagram, and against every shred of instinct screaming at him to leave it alone, he tapped the screen. The air rushed out of him as if he'd been kicked. There was Miles, his ex, grinning in a sharp blazer beside a woman in a flowing white dress, her hand resting on his arm. The caption stabbed at Evan's chest, "New chapter. Thankful for a clean slate." He scrolled, his pulse hammering, and found Miles' comment below, finally free of the past. "No more mistakes. No more sin." Each word was a blade, carving into the fragile hope Evan hadn't even known he'd been clinging to. Sin. That's what Miles called him now, a mistake to be erased. "Evan?" Noah's voice cut through the haze, laced with concern as he stood and crossed to the table. Evan didn't respond, just thrust the phone toward him, his hand shaking so hard the screen blurred. Noah took it, his jaw tightening as he read. "This the guy?" he asked, though the answer was obvious. Evan nodded, his throat too raw to form words. "He's getting married." He finally choked out, his voice a broken rasp. "To a woman. After us, after everything, he's saying I was the sin." The room spun, the edges of his vision darkening as the betrayal sank in deeper, a wound reopened and salted. Noah set the phone down, his brown eyes flashing with something fierce. "He's a coward, Evan. That's not your shame to carry." But Evan barely heard him, lost in a flood of memories, Miles' whispered promises in the dark, the way he'd smiled before tearing Evan's world apart with Tyler. 2 years of grief surged up, and then the phone rang, shrill and insistent. "Dad?" Evan's stomach dropped, but he answered, steeling himself for the blow he knew was coming. "Evan." Paul's voice crackled through, smug and biting. "I just heard from your aunt. Miles is tying the knot. Good for him, finally doing something right, marrying that nice girl. I knew he had it in him to be a man, not like." He paused, the silence heavy with contempt, and Evan's grip tightened on the phone. "You should take a lesson," Paul added, his tone icy. "Maybe there's still time to fix what's wrong with you." The line went dead, But the words echoed, hollowing Evan out until he felt like a shell. He dropped the phone, the clatter loud in the stillness, and his breath came in short, ragged gasps. "He's proud of him," Evan said, his voice barely a whisper, cracking under the weight. "My own dad thinks Miles is better off pretending I never existed." Tears welled, hot and furious, but he refused to let them fall, pressing his palms against the table until his knuckles whitened. Noah slid into the chair beside him, close enough that Evan could feel the warmth radiating from him, but not touching, not yet. "He's wrong," Noah said, firm and low. "They both are. Miles is running, and your dad's buying the lie. That's on them." Evan shook his head, bitterness spilling out like bile. "You don't get it. He's all I had left, my last tie to family, and he's choosing Miles' bullshit over me." His voice broke, and he buried his face in his hands, shoulders trembling as the dam finally gave way. The tears came then, silent and searing, and he hated how they stripped him bare. Noah stayed quiet for a moment, letting the storm rage, then reached out, his hand resting lightly on Evan's arm. "You're not alone," he said softly. "I know it feels like you're drowning, but you're not. I see you, Evan. You're enough." The touch jolted him, a lifeline in the chaos, and Evan flinched but didn't pull away. Noah's hand was warm, steady, grounding him as the pain clawed at his chest. "I don't feel like enough," he whispered, lifting his head. His eyes were wet, red-rimmed, and vulnerable in a way that made him want to hide. "He's erasing me, and my dad's cheering him on." Noah's grip tightened, gentle but unyielding. "Then don't let them write your story. Miles is hiding from himself, and your dad's too blind to see the truth. That's their failure, not yours." Evan met Noah's gaze, the intensity there cutting through the fog of despair. Something flickered inside him, anger maybe, or the faint pulse of defiance. "I hate him," he said, the words tumbling out, rough and unpolished. "Miles. My dad. I hate that I still care what they think." Noah nodded, no trace of judgment, just a quiet understanding that anchored Evan. "You're allowed to hate them," he said. "But don't let it eat you alive." The rain started up again outside, a soft patter against the glass, but inside, something shifted. Noah stayed, his presence a silent promise, and Evan felt the first fragile stirrings of fight beneath the hurt. Miles' wedding loomed like a shadow, and Paul's rejection was a fresh scar, but with Noah beside him, Evan wasn't ready to break, not yet. The truth had exploded, shattering what little he'd held onto, but in the wreckage he glimpsed a chance to claw his way out. The low rumble of the car engine filled the tense silence as Evan Carter gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pale against the cracked vinyl. Rain streaked the windshield, blurring the highway stretching toward the Chicago suburbs, but his resolve burned bright and unyielding. It had been 2 days since Miles' Instagram post branded him a sin, 2 days since his father's voice had severed their last fragile tie, and Evan was done shrinking into the shadows. Beside him, Noah sat quiet, his presence a calm counterpoint to the storm brewing in Evan's chest. "You sure about this?" Noah asked, his voice steady, not pressing, just checking. Evan's jaw tightened as he nodded. "I have to." The wedding was at a modest church in Oak Park, its steeple piercing the gray sky, white siding gleaming wet under the drizzle. Evan parked a block away, the faint strains of organ music drifting through the damp air like a call to battle. Noah squeezed his shoulder, his touch warm through Evan's hoodie. "I'll be here when you're done," he said, his brown eyes steady with quiet faith. Evan managed a tight smile, gratitude flickering through the nerves, then stepped out into the mist, his heart pounding a fierce rhythm. Inside, the church buzzed with murmurs, pews packed with faces Evan half remembered, Miles' cousins, old high school friends, his father, Paul, stiff in a gray suit near the front. Evan slipped into the back row, unnoticed, his damp clothes clashing with the sea of pressed dresses and ties. Miles stood at the altar, polished in a black tux, his bride glowing in white lace, her smile serene. The pastor's voice droned on about unity and grace, words that tasted like ash to Evan. His hands clenched in his lap, nails biting into his palms as the moment swelled inside him, a pressure he couldn't contain. "Do you, Miles, take this woman?" the pastor began, and Evan's body moved before his mind could catch up. He stood, the wooden chair scraping loudly against the floor, and a ripple of gasps swept through the crowd. Every head turned, eyes wide, mouths agape. Miles froze, his face draining of color as Evan stepped into the aisle, his sneakers squeaking on the polished wood. "Evan, what the hell?" Miles stammered, his voice cracking, but Evan cut him off, his own voice shaking but rising, filling the space. "You don't get to do this," Evan said loud and clear, the words echoing off the stained glass. "You don't get to stand there and act like I never happened. 2 years, Miles, you said you loved me, then you slept with Tyler and threw me away like garbage. And now you're calling it a sin to wash your hands of me?" His chest heaved, the dam of silence he'd lived behind for too long bursting open. "You're a liar. You've been lying to me, to her, to everyone here, and most of all to yourself." The bride's hands flew to her mouth, tears spilling over, and the congregation erupted in hushed chaos. Paul shot to his feet, his face a mask of rage, storming down the aisle toward Evan. "Stop this right now!" he barked, his voice trembling with fury. "You're humiliating us, yourself. You're no son of mine, not after this." The words cut deep, a final blade through whatever hope Evan had left for his father's love, but he stood taller, meeting Paul's glare with fire in his eyes. "I'm not here for you," he said, his voice steady now, unshaken. "I'm here for me." Miles took a step forward, his hands clenched, shame and anger warring on his face. "Get out," he snapped, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him, the cracks in his perfect mask widening. Evan laughed, a bitter, ragged sound that rang through the church. "You can marry her, Miles, but you'll never outrun who you are." "I did." He turned, feeling the weight of every stare, some shocked, some scornful, a few flickering with something like respect, and walked out, his head high despite the adrenaline shaking his legs. Outside, the drizzle had stopped, the air crisp and clean, washing away the stifling weight of the church. Noah leaned against the car, his eyes searching Evan's face as he approached, concern softening into relief. "You okay?" he asked, stepping closer. Evan exhaled, the rush crashing into exhaustion, his breath visible in the cold. "No," he admitted, his voice raw. "But I will be." Noah pulled him into a hug, strong and unwavering, and Evan sank into it, letting the warmth chase away the chill of Paul's words. "He disowned me," Evan murmured against Noah's shoulder, the reality settling like stones in his gut. Noah's arms tightened around him. "He doesn't deserve you. What you did in there. That was fearless, braver than anyone I've ever seen." Evan pulled back, meeting Noah's gaze, and saw pride there, fierce and real, mingled with something deeper he wasn't ready to name. "I had to say it," he said, wiping a hand across his face. "For me. To stop letting them define me." Noah nodded, a faint smile breaking through. "And you did. Now what?" Evan glanced back at the church, the distant hum of chaos still audible, then at Noah. "Now I figure out who I am without them." Noah's hand found his, fingers threading together, warm and sure. "You won't do it alone," he said, and the promise settled into Evan's bones, a quiet strength he hadn't known he could lean on. As they drove back to Chicago, the weight of Miles' lies and Paul's rejection didn't vanish, but for the first time, Evan felt it start to shift, a burden he might finally set down. The Chicago skyline shimmered under a rare September sun, its golden light spilling through the windows of Common Ground, Evan Carter's new coffee shop on the edge of Logan Square. 6 months had passed since he'd stormed out of Miles' wedding, 6 months since he'd shed the weight of his father's rejection, and Evan stood behind the counter now, wiping down the espresso machine with a quiet pride. The shop was small, its brick walls lined with local art, but it hummed with life, laughter, the clatter of mugs, the soft murmur of voices. A rainbow flag hung above the door, understated but bold, a quiet promise of safety for anyone who needed it. Evan had poured everything into this place, his savings, his sleepless nights, his heart, and it had become his anchor. Noah leaned against the counter, sketching on a napkin as he often did, this time capturing Evan's profile, less tense now, the lines of his face softened by time and purpose. "You're staring again," Evan said, catching his eye with a half-smile, the kind that came easier these days. Noah grinned, unrepentant, his brown eyes warm. "Can't help it. You look good back there, happy." Evan rolled his eyes, but a flush crept up his neck, a steady warmth he didn't shy from anymore. Noah had been there through it all, hauling furniture, testing coffee blends, holding him when the silence of Paul's absence stung too deep. They weren't rushing to define what they had, but it felt solid, a trust Evan was learning to believe in. The bell chimed, and a cluster of regulars shuffled in, a lesbian couple sharing a pastry, a non-binary teen with a shy grin, an older man who'd once told Evan this was the first place he'd felt welcome since coming out. "Evan, still got that chai special?" the teen called, and he nodded, already reaching for the spices. Always. This was his family now, not bound by blood but by something stronger, acceptance, presence, the kind of belonging he'd craved since Miles ripped it away. Paul hadn't called since that day in the church, and Miles' silence was a closed chapter. Evan had stopped waiting for either to turn back. He thought of Miles sometimes, wondering if the facade held. 2 months ago, he'd stumbled across a news snippet online. Miles' wife had filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. No specifics, but Evan could guess. The truth Miles had buried under vows and denial had clawed its way out. It wasn't victory Evan felt, just a muted sadness for the man he'd once loved, and a quiet relief that he'd escaped that prison. Paul, too, faced his own reckoning. Neighbors had mentioned he'd grown withdrawn, alone in his stubborn pride, his judgment isolating him more than it ever had Evan. Their choices had consequences, and Evan no longer carried the blame. Later, as dusk painted the sky in purples and golds, Evan locked up and joined Noah on the sidewalk. They walked to a nearby park, settling on a bench beneath a sprawl of stars. The air was cool, tinged with the scent of fallen leaves, and Evan tipped his head back, letting it fill his lungs. "You ever miss them?" Noah asked, his voice soft, tracing idle patterns on Evan's hand. Evan paused, the ache still there but fainter now, a scar instead of a wound. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But not enough to want them back." Noah nodded, his understanding a quiet gift. "You've built something better here." Evan looked at him, at the man who'd seen him shattered and stayed anyway. "Yeah," he said, squeezing Noah's hand, the contact grounding him. "I have." The words carried weight, a truth he felt in his bones, and then Noah leaned in, kissing him, slow, gentle, a moment free of pressure or fear. Evan kissed back, letting himself sink into it, the past's shadows no match for this light. "I used to think love was just hurt," Evan murmured when they parted, his forehead resting against Noah's. "That's all it ever gave me, pain, betrayal." Noah brushed a thumb across his cheek, his touch tender. "And now?" Evan smiled, small but real, the kind that reached his eyes. "Now it's freedom. You helped me see that." Noah's gaze softened, and he pulled Evan close, their breaths mingling in the crisp night air. Back at the apartment, Evan pinned Noah's latest sketch to the fridge, a reminder of the man he'd been and the one he was becoming. He wasn't the broken kid Miles had discarded, or the son Paul had shamed. He was Evan, 27, gay, whole, and that was enough. The moon hung bright outside, silver light spilling over the city, and as he slid into bed beside Noah, the soft rhythm of Noah's breathing lulled him. Miles' unraveling and Paul's solitude were the fallout of their own making, but Evan's future belonged to him. Under the stars, with Noah's warmth beside him, he felt peace settle deep, a home he'd fought for, and finally found.